Right, I think we're ready to go. So again, welcome to those of you that are coming here for the first time, and some of you will have been at this session this morning. My name is Jenny Horton, and I'm Public Art Coordinator with Grangegorman Development Agency. And I'm going to give really a sort of a two-minute introduction of the panel today. This is our second conversation, and it focuses on policy and provision for public art within a European and international context. There are 5 conversants and will be chaired by Dr. Ciarán Benson. For the role of chair, we look for a person who had occupied a senior academic post and who has chaired national bodies and given advice to government. Ciarán is Emeritus Professor of Psychology at University College Dublin. He is known to many of us in Ireland as a previous chair of the Arts Council and also chair of Poetry Ireland, and then in his present position as chair of The Lives We Live. Ciarán is probably one of the most informed arts persons in Ireland and is a highly respected thinker, activist and influencer in relation to policy formation in the arts. So he was an easy choice. In relation to the panel, we looked for local, national and international speakers with expertise in commissioning and public art policy development. Sinéad O'Reilly is presently head of local and public art with the Arts Council and works very closely with the Irish government's interdepartmental group, which is responsible for the Percent for Art scheme, which has been running in Ireland for over 40 years. She is also an experienced arts professional in relation to public art and has broken the boundaries in this field. Paraic McQuaid is an artist, but he lectures in cultural policy and is a recognized expert and author for the Compendium of Cultural Policies, as well as for the European Network on Culture. Nora Ceciliedatter Nerdrum leads the art section in Public Art Norway, which is a very sophisticated organization managing public art called Koro. She's also an art historian and a curator in her own right. And she's currently very involved with a curatorial team, working on the art project for the new government quarter in Oslo. Unfortunately, Tanja Karreman, who was to be coming from Holland, can't be here today, and she sends her apologies. It's a COVID-related issue. Ó'Cuív is Public Art Officer with Dublin City Council. His principal role is the development of Dublin City Public Art Programme. He has a central role in the implementation of Dublin City Council public art policy, and he's highly respected right across the art spectrum. He has forged many new policies, in particular in relation to the decommissioning of public art, and he's a strong advocate for arts in all disciplines. Dr. Ailbhe Murphy is also an artist, but she is director of Create. Create is the national agency for collaborative arts in Ireland. So working very much at a local, but also a national level. And she has a lot of experience of working at the European level. Create manages the Artist in Residency scheme for the Arts Council and is leading the Arts Council's 3-year Creative Places pilot programme in the west of Ireland. At the end of this, I'm pleased the Q&A is open right now and right to the end. Our esteemed conference coordinator, Grania Coughlin, will field the questions that come through this discussion. So we want you to be part of the conversation. We want you to throw up the difficult questions. So I hope you have a lovely afternoon, and over to you, Ciarán.
Thanks very much, Jenny. You're all very welcome. I'm delighted to be able to converse with this highly distinguished panel, and I'm hoping that those of you who are listening will be able to come in at some point with your questions. In this webinar, we want to raise questions about the particular opportunities to be availed of, the pitfalls to be avoided, when imagining what good public art should be, when advocating for it, when funding it, when actively curating it, or when determining its functional lifespan. There's no aspect of public art to which policy is not relevant. We're acutely aware that the changing nature of public art is connected to the changing digital and other technologies. And they have begun to present over the last 30 years extraordinary opportunities for transformations of public art. For myself, I'm attracted to working primarily from concrete examples that we might agree to have worked or not worked, rather than primarily from abstract general principles. Those of you who are interested in philosophy might know it as the distinction between e.g. thinking and i.e. thinking. The ever-present role of politics in both the small and large senses of the word has to be part of our thinking whenever art aspires to animate public spaces. The history of public art is partly, as we know, a history of the statue. And the recently high-profile controversies concerning 19th century statues in particular is a case study for these issues. Just as a background, what in psychology we call priming, the example I'd like to give is the example of the Cecil Rhodes statue on the wall of Oriel College in Oxford. As you know, that is a very live issue, including internal boycotts in Oxford and so on. But I was particularly struck by the suggestion of Anthony Gormley. As you can see, the statue stands high in a niche on the college wall. And Gormley's suggestion, which I think is inspired, is simply to turn the statue to face the wall in shame. This strategy moves the gaze of both the viewer and of Rhodes rather than removes the statue, and thereby materializes that continuity of the actual debate about the significance of Rhodes with a new before and after, a real turning point put in stone. So you could think of it as a counterpoint to the rather contentious policies in Britain of the culture secretary there, retain and explain. You could have it as move and remove. You can find lots of examples, and they're the sort of things that will lie at the back of what we're going to talk about today. Now, as Jenny has said, we have 5 distinguished panelists. Each will begin by addressing a question for 3 minutes. And after this, we'll open up the panel discussion for about 40 minutes. And we will then open up the floor for questions from the audience, which will be relayed to me from Grania and Roisin. So we will start with Sinéad, who will outline the current situation in Ireland. And then Paraic will frame the issues within a European context. Nora will speak of her specific experience in Norway. Ruairí will then consider some issues from his experience in Dublin, and Ailbhe will conclude with reflections on her interests in commissioning. And as chair, I'll gently mark the conclusion of each 3-minute segment for the panelists' information. So we're going to begin with Sinéad. And I'm wondering, Sinéad, can you give us an overview of the Percent for Art scheme in Ireland today? You're on mute, Sinéad.
I should know better by now than to not do that. Thanks, Ciarán. Well, the Percent for Art scheme, as you know, has existed for over 40 years in Ireland. First used and indeed created by the Office of Public Works to purchase artworks for public and state buildings, to when it expanded to all government departments with capital budgets in 1997. Of course, public art has a long history in Ireland before this, and our town and cityscapes are still filled with many commemorative sculptures dating back to the 1800s. And as Ciarán just referenced, we were busy commemorating historical events and political figures with sculptures quite prolifically right up to the 1960s. Save a brief period around the turn of the 20th century when we were busy fighting for independence and actually taking down many sculptures relating to British rule. Prior to the 1990s, much public art in its physical form was philanthropically funded or fundraised for by committees. This expansion of the scheme from 1997 also coincided with new positions of local authority arts officers. And from this time, public art really began to respond to a people and a place, becoming more site-specific, shifting away from commemoration and representation and expanding to include many other art forms. We've taken a massive leap forward in commissioning public art under the Percent for Art scheme in the last 25 years, especially in the last 10 to 15 years. We've seen commissioning practices shift to experiential and durational work and including more types of arts practice and arts forms. The visible reminders we still have in our landscape and townscapes of permanent artworks often makes it challenging for many commissioners and artists to pursue more contemporary arts practices. Expectations often exist still for the physical and for the permanent, raising questions if there was still a hierarchical value placed on the visible and the tangible than on the strong evidence that participatory arts activity generates better and often more sustainable benefits when it comes to thinking about regeneration strategies, which public art is often tied into. In Ireland, we have a strong practice of local public art policies, and many of them address the value of public art in community and participatory contexts. But in the current absence of a national policy, it's understandable why there is still an underlying discourse of values attached to different types of public art. However, we're moving into a more developmental space with the Percent for Art scheme, thankfully. The move by government to increase the funding from the 1st of January 2020 has led to new intentions to develop a national policy and create better cohesion of the scheme from both commissioners and different government departments' perspectives, ultimately benefiting both the artist and the public. This rise in the funding available for commissioning is potentially transformative. For decades, it was capped at 64,000, and over time, this has really restricted the ambition of artists to respond to opportunities in exciting ways. The Arts Council will have a much more enhanced role in the development of the Percent for Art scheme going forward. We already run publicart.ie, and our own policy on the Percent for Art scheme is about advocating for best practice use of the scheme to benefit both artists and the public, which ties into our strategy Making Great Artwork. It's a developmental role we're really looking forward to, working in that collegial space across many government departments and public bodies who have a role in the development of the scheme. And we have come a long way, but there's always more work to be done.
Thanks very much, Sinéad. I'm now going to go to Paraic, who, in addition to having his own practice, is very involved in European thinking. So Paraic, what are the policy issues for public art in Europe now, as you understand them?
Thanks, Ciarán. So it's only a short time we're allocated here, so I don't have time to cover all aspects of art in public. So I'm focusing very specifically on the 1% for Art scheme and its variations across Europe, whereby a percentage of the construction cost of a public build can be set aside for the purpose of commissioning an artwork. So I'm mainly looking at the policy and process end of this, and less so from the aesthetic or artistic perspective. So my first finding is that the information available on Percent for Art schemes is hard to find at the European level. It's much easier to find information on direct cultural budgets than the Percent for Art scheme. However, I've gathered some information from Spain, Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany. And I've also looked at a particular study by the Bookman Foundation from 2020, looking at the Percent for Art scheme and looking at a comparative analysis across Europe, within which Ireland looks quite favourable, especially given the recent increase in funding. So what I found is that the majority of the Percent for Art schemes across Europe began life as a national scheme or implemented by the national government. So they vary from starting point from 50 years ago to 90 years ago. We're mainly in that traditional sense of the sculpture or the artwork attached to a public building. So a variation of this occurs in Spain, where there's a 1% for culture scheme that began as legislation within the National Heritage Act. So it contains a shared function across heritage preservation and new creativity. But unfortunately, because of this design, there's been very little use of the new creativity function, and most of the money is spent on heritage conservation and preservation. There are also different interpretations of the financial model of the scheme in Germany and Belgium, where the range of percentages range from 0.25% up to 1.5%, depending on the scale of the construction costs associated with the commission. So most states operate the scheme at a municipal or local authority level, even though it started out as a national level. So it's developed that way in most countries. And at a local authority level, the scheme acts as a booster for local cultural budgets. But it's worth considering the reasons why local authorities support the scheme. So the Bookman report found that beautification of the environment was a high priority, followed by a desire for social added value, followed finally by an investment in culture and artists. The report also found that there's a lack of awareness, knowledge or understanding of the scheme by municipal officials, and found that that was an issue, as well as a shortage of expertise in the field to administer the scheme. So thinking about it from a policy perspective, it's worth questioning whether the function of the scheme as written in its original legislative form needs to be reconsidered. The original intention is beautification of public realm and support for visual artists. The interpretation of the scheme in Ireland and the UK, as pointed out by Sinéad as well, has expanded beyond this physical and permanent works into a broad range of disciplines and forms, many of which are ephemeral. So this would draw into question whether the original legislation accurately reflects its current interpretation. Then on a process level, the process varies greatly in different European countries. In some cases, like Belgium, the request is encouraged to come from the client or the stakeholder group, so emerging from a need. In the Netherlands, then there's a national agency for spatial planning, which includes the Percent for Art scheme in its brief. In Spain, the program is coordinated by an interministerial committee composed of the members from the Ministry of Culture and Ministry of Development. But it's worth thinking about how top-down or bottom-up the process is and how culturally democratic. There's the question of whether there should be a national agency or whether there is a national responsibility of some kind, or whether such an agency should be decentralized further away from the central state, or maybe an association of public arts officers would serve better given their local expertise, or maybe it's a combination of a few of these things. So yeah, it's worth considering the values that should inform the policy function, process, and the results of the scheme to ensure public participation, cultural democracy, and public engagement. So more people-centered approach, maybe. So these values should inform the legislation, the strategy, and the stakeholder engagement.
Thank you very much, Paraic. And now I'll turn to Nora, and I'm going to ask Nora to talk about how the concept of public art has changed over recent decades as they've experienced it in Norway, and how Public Art Norway has adapted to this change in the nature and understanding of what public art is. Nora.
Thank you, Ciarán. Very nice to meet all of you. Well, the historic background of our institution is, in a way, a reflection of what has happened in the field of public art on a more general level. So I thought it might be useful to do a short introduction to the development of Public Art Norway, or Koro, as we call it here. Koro is, of course, the national agency of public art in Norway. In 1976, the Norwegian Parliament passed legislation that resulted in the establishment of what is now known as Koro. The organization was originally known as Utsmykkingsfondet, which is literally the Decorations Beautifications Foundation. And it was established in response to historical trends that had also been central to the development of official cultural policy in Norway. Artistic decorations for key public buildings were seen as important to the efforts to promote the Norwegian national identity during the nation building era in the 19th and 20th centuries. Also, in the 1950s and 60s, the government established the first funding programs for art for government, country council, and municipal buildings. And these programs were part of a policy to disseminate culture to audiences in locations throughout Norway, which was also reflected in the establishment of other bodies to promote professional cultural and artistic touring events, including exhibitions, film screenings, theater, and concerts, and so on. Then from the 1930s onwards, artists' organizations in Norway and other organizations involved in the visual arts and architecture had campaigned for the introduction of a Percent for Art program that would apply to the construction budgets for governmental buildings. And such programs had been established in the States as early as 1934, and in Sweden as early actually as 1937, for example. And after what we call the artists' action in 1974, the campaigning efforts of Norwegian artists culminated in the funding of a series of programs for the visual arts. However, as much as 20 years would actually pass from the establishment of Utsmykkingsfondet in 1976 until a Present for Art program was for government buildings materialized. And this came about through the establishment of the arts program for new government buildings in 1997. This program is still running and entails the setting aside of 0 to 1.5% of a building's construction budget for art, depending on the public significance of the building. So the average level is around 0.75, I would say. Around the turn of the millennium, Utsmykkingsfondet took over responsibility for Art Council Norway's program for art in municipal and country council buildings. And for the first time, artists and curators could also apply for funding for their own projects. And this contributed to a significant revitalization of the general understanding of public artworks and working methods, also in accordance with general international trends in the arts. So in 2006, Utsmykkingsfondet changed its name to Koro, which is the current name. And the change of name should be understood as a reaction to a growing understanding amongst artists' communities of decoration as a mere decoration, an activity that was completely subservient to the architecture of the building. Individuals and organizations in the arts, both in Norway and internationally, wanted public spaces to be seen as venues for works that allowed for active, reflective, and critical artistic expressions. According to such thinking, public art allowed for more direct and engaging encounters with the public. Many believe that public spaces, as alternative venues to museums and galleries, were to be preferred because they allowed for different expressive and progressive opportunities. Today, and as a reflection of our historical past, our role within Norwegian cultural policy is twofold. It is to ensure that as many people as possible encounter a diverse range of high-quality artworks in public buildings and other public spaces, but also to contribute to the development of contemporary art and provide artists with commissions and incomes. In 2021, currently we are producing more than 50 projects, large and small, with the art projects that you mentioned, Ciarán, at the new government quarter as the largest project Koro has ever conducted, with around 100 million Norwegian kroners set aside for art projects. I can't do the, I'm not really sure how many euros that is at the moment, but it's a lot of money. We have art schemes for projects initiated by artists and curators and municipality, and we are managing a vast collection of around 8,000 works all around the country and abroad. We also have an extensive educational program, including a program for educating curators that want to work within our field.
Thank you, Nora. I'm just trying to calculate what 100 million donors would be. I haven't got there.
15 million.
I'm going to move now to Ruairí, and I know that what Nora has said leads on very well to what you're interested in. So my question to you, Ruairí, is how can we encourage commissioners and policymakers to embrace contemporary art in all its forms and practices, and to firmly root public art in the present, even if at times it ponders the past and the future?
And to address that question, I suppose to me, I focus on the word art when it comes to public art. I find it very hard to differentiate between art as described in other contexts and public art. So to me, all public art should be and is art. And in that note, to me, what makes art very, very important in societies, in communities, for all of us, is that dialogue that takes place between an artwork and the participant, the viewer, the listener, and the engager. And where there's dialogue, then there's power, there's space, there's room. And to me, while the permanent, and I come from an art historical background, so there's no greater joy than to go into a gallery or to look at a wonderful public sculpture. But to me, art is not confined to those things. And when I do look at a picture or a public sculpture, the ones that work are the ones that create dialogue. And I am concerned at a slippage that can happen when we go back into the monument or the statue, because here it doesn't become dialogue, it becomes dictation, it becomes singular view. And so I want to, and in Dublin City Council, we actively, and we're about to launch a new programme next week, we're actively seeking for Dublin City Council to address three themes or strands: the public, art, and the city. And within the art, we're calling for artists, creative producers, curators, and this is very like your approach, I hope, Nora, without putting words in your mouth, but I chimed very much with me. We're asking for artists to make the proposals as opposed to us setting out what they should do. For the public, and I've been engaging deeply with my colleague and arts officer, Ray Yates, but also one of the people I've been engaging with has been Ailbhe, is we're trying to pioneer a new program where the public have a leading role. So perhaps, why don't we trust the public? Perhaps over a period of 2 or 3 years, deep engagement with public art hubs in local areas, we can pilot this program where the public are leading us towards the engagement with artists and the creation of public art or art. And then finally, the city section is at times there are occasions, and I suppose the Luke Kelly sculpture was one, but also where whether it's the Office of Public Works who do state building, or it's National Roads Authority or transport or infrastructure, where we have specific sites that we address and that those commissions happen. One small detail, and I think it is about your kind of policy and structure. In our call for proposals, we tend not to set a budget. We're asking artists to come up with ideas ranging from 20,000 euros up to 100. And if we had a budget like you, Nora, it would be 200,000 euros. And we're asking artists to come up with ideas and to put the money to one side for a moment and to have the budget they propose match the idea. And in that way, I think we come back to what we're here to do, is to assist, to excite, to engage with the public, and to commission wonderful art.
Thanks, Rory. I'll turn now to Ailbhe. And Ailbhe, your experience is extensive in commissioning as well. So I know you're particularly interested in how policy keeps up with, or indeed anticipates, the changes in artistic practice, particularly in the public sphere. And I know also that you're interested in questions of time and duration in public art. So I'm wondering, what kind of infrastructure do you think is needed to support work such as that durational work in the context of public art and public spaces?
Thank you very much, Ciarán, and indeed delighted to be here to discuss some of these ideas. So yes, indeed, when I was thinking about this question, indeed in the broader context of policy and provision, I found myself taking my lead a little from political theorist Chantal Mouffe when she speaks of public art as not art in the public space, but an art that institutes a public space, a space of common action among people. And if I could just maybe refer to one particular project as an instance to look at this question of infrastructure and support. This is the What Does He, oh, thank you very much. This is the What Does He Need project, a long-term durational project by a visual artist and writer, Fiona Whelan, the theatre company Broken Talkers, and the Rialto Youth Project, which is a youth and community development project situated in the south inner city of Dublin. And the image you see is the latest iteration in what is this long-term project that has involved multiple arts and community partners. And as delegates, you will have had access to the audio work that accompanies this poster project. And essentially what does he need is exploring how men and boys are shaped by and influence the world they live in. And the project is aiming to create a significant public dialogue about the current state of masculinity. And if I could have the next slide, please. So as I say, this is one aspect of a multi-layered project, but these posters in 3 sites of the city have prompted active engagement with members of the public, and indeed have acted precisely as art that institutes a public space where, and if I could have the next slide, please, the artists and the Rialto Youth Project have hosted workshops at these very posters in the city. And you'll see here how young people, in this case particularly, boys and young men specifically, have interacted with the poster, directly responding to the text, what does he need? And they've written onto this poster things like, he needs support, he needs a da, he needs not to be abused, he needs to be accepted for who he is, he needs a kiss. So in addition, and in addition to the posters and in an earlier developmental phase of this project, the artists have developed a unique transdisciplinary workshop methodology, the creation of a boy, and there have been 13 of these boys created across the city with different community groups. And this development of this crucial methodology was supported by the Lives We Live programme here in Grangegorman Development Agency, where Broken Talkers were in residency with Fiona and working with community groups in Dublin 7, and in particular the Children and Youth Action Group of the Northwest Inner City Network. So with regard to the question of policy, how do we create this infrastructure that can account for complex engagements such as this project, What Does He Need, that leads to the creation of not only art in public, but art that institutes a public space, both in its making, in the context, let's say, of the methodology around the workshop process, and in terms of its production and its temporal manifestations, such as the poster and the audio work that we see. And so for us, and I would point to a very complex scaffolding of support that has developed around this project over perhaps the last 2 years, involving Dublin City Council, the Arts Council, the Lives We Live, the Lab Gallery, among others, and the Irish Museum of Modern Art. And this is one way in which we also have to take a durational view of the kind of infrastructural supports that actually can allow this work to manifest into the public space in meaningful ways at times of great importance, as identified by the community and the artists themselves.
Thanks very much, Ailbhe. So now we've had a brief introduction to some of the concerns of each of our panelists. And we're going to open up now to a general discussion. And I'd like to do that using a quote from an interview given in April of this year by Vivian Lovell of Modus Operandi in the UK. And it's in connection, really, I suppose, to take Ruairí's point about dialogue, the dialogue between artists and communities, between funders and commissioners and artists and so on. She said this: between those polarities, reasons, and that is the reasons for supporting public art, reasons include a variety of motives, such as appointing an artist as a creative catalyst in the community. That's very like what Ailbhe has just been talking about. Or continuing a tradition of arts patronage, or creating distinctive, memorable buildings and environments, which is the history that Nora and others have dealt with, or amplifying the site's connection to history or current usage, the contemporary culture wars, like the Oriel College example, celebrating or commemorating an event or person. Jenny mentioned that we're in the middle in Ireland of what we call the centenary, the decade of centenaries, which will finish in 2 years' time with our civil war. So the issue of how to commemorate is very live in Ireland, but it's also, we can see across the world, a very live issue in terms of past commemorations. So given that those are the backgrounds, the background purposes of a kind that Vivian Lovell has been talking about, would you like to come in to have a discussion on how you think the nature of art itself has changed? And whether, I mean, Rory, you mentioned that you're particularly interested in the notion, the conception of art. Do you have anything to clarify on this? Or should this be left to be an open project? Should we just jettison old notions of art and see what happens? Open to the panel.
Well, you addressed me, and I'm not sure old notions of art might be portrayed as 19th century notions of art, where, as my ex-lecturer and wonderful expert in sculpture described the 19th century right across Europe, what was known as statue mania. And so I think actually art goes back further than that. And I think the embellishment of buildings, it didn't take long in the, in this brief history of Centre for Art or public art in Ireland. It didn't take long for the arts movement to kind of address the establishment and to challenge them and say, but this doesn't represent art. This represents embellishment. And I think that's a good place, you know, to start.
Nora?
That's it out of the commemoration alone. I very firmly, and as you know, and we discussed this, you know, I've been privileged enough to work with a number of artists in a very, very deep way in the notion of commemoration, but in a more complex one, such as the Sound Art Commission up in the Irish War Memorial Gardens, dedicated to First World War soldiers, Irish people who died, but with a German sound artist. And that alone, the partnership with Dublin City Council, the trustees, the British soldiers who were the trustees, and the Goethe Institute in itself, I think, while it's not a formula, gives an insight at how more sensitive and more complex ways can be used to address such things as commemoration.
Well, this brings us, I mean, I know Nora in Norway, you've talked about the general policy to support work that is universally accessible, but not necessarily universally acceptable. That was a distinction I liked. Would you? I know you have views on this, on how things are changing.
Yeah. We're always trying to change how we do things according to how the art field is developing. So we're trying to, we're saying that we're not operating with one methodology, for example. We're always changing the methodology we work with to sort of meet the requirements of the artists and the current art situation. So at the moment we're talking about, I mean, I mentioned the huge budget for the government buildings, but actually the budget is not that important. Many times you could actually make or produce really great artworks because you have a good brief. I mean, the good brief is sometimes the most important thing you have, or the most important thing the curator develops in an art project. So currently we're talking about how to make good briefs, and a good brief would be a brief that ensures the artist's artistic freedom, even though there are many boundaries and many things to take into consideration when you operate within the field of public art. Because you have to talk to the architect, you have to talk to the builder, you have to in some way be considerate to the people that are going to use the building you're working within. And we're talking about how to ensure artistic freedom in the best possible way.
Thank you. Would anybody else like to come in? Would Ailbhe, your poster campaign on masculinity is a direct both challenge and invitation to participation for people who pass by. So do you want to speak about that?
Sure. I mean, I'd have to sort of preempt by saying that we have a, you know, through the initial residency, we have a connection to this project, but that this is most definitively Fiona and Broken Talkers and the Rialto Youth Project's work in that sense. And I'm speaking about it because I find it to be very compelling. But I think that this idea that we've moved very far away, thankfully, I think, from the kind of static object in public space, and they have perhaps to some degree still a relevance. However, I think that what I really increasingly interested in, and created the National Development Agency for Collaborative Arts naturally is increasingly interested in, is to go back to what Ruairí was proposing, which is the dialogue, and how the art in public space can prompt and provoke discussion, dissensus. It's not about amelioration of difference, I would say. And when it comes to questions of the built environment, and in this changing, so we say, landscape of public art practice, I mean, I can remember being at a conference where there was a lot of architects speaking with great and tremendous enthusiasm about the unique contribution that artists can make in the initial stages of imagining our public spaces. However, the overarching frame really was to be there as a mechanism for consensus actually as a kind of the front line, if you like, of a so-called consultation process that was actually going to result in a regeneration of an area, no matter what the community said. So in a sense, artists can be instrumentalized in the context of public art in that way. And in fact, people can get very excited and make claims that simply an artist seated at a table alone is enough to prompt lateral thinking. And this, of course, is very unsatisfactory. So I'm responding very much to what Nora is saying. To maintain and create and pay attention to the kind of flexibility that's needed in order to create the kinds of infrastructure that we need to see requires very particular attention and ongoing attention, and a willingness, if you like, not to sit still. And this is why I think the question of how is it that policy can keep up with, never mind be ahead of practice, is really important. I think that's its greatest challenge. And for an organization like Create, who are kind of conduit, if you like, between artists and community, and maybe statutory agencies and others involved in such complex projects, for me, the question of how we analyze and build a critical register around this work so that we can advocate for those kinds of longitudinal infrastructures and support mechanisms is really important, and is a key responsibility, I think, for organizations like ourselves.
Thanks, Ailbhe. Paraic, I know you have an interest in this general question of art having a political voice. Would you like to come in on that? You're on mute.
Sure, yeah. I liked Ailbhe's use of the word dissensus. I was just reading Jacques Rancière has a book on the topic, kind of calling for more dissensus within society to inform a more functioning democracy. And I think the example of Fiona Whelan's and Broken Talkers and Rialto Youth Project work is a good example of. I'm also a fan of Krzysztof Wodiczko and his writings, and he talks about art, public art, that its function is to exhibit or expose in public what is supposed to be kept in the private realm, and it often requires breaking a code of invisibility and silence. So this kind of speaks to that idea of dissensus and that function within art. And we have some recent examples of this in Ireland within the realm of graffiti, mostly with Mazer's mural on Project Art Centre and Joe Caslin's mural on George's Street as well, which you can kind of see as being quite effective in encouraging discourse that directly affected political change. But in terms of policy and how policy should reflect that, I think we have to kind of think of broader policy as well in terms of cultural rights, in terms of freedom of expression, freedom of artistic expression within society. Those are influenced not just by a public art policy, but by broader policies within society. Also, when you look at, well, what is the public realm or the public space, and how is that defined by policy? We have bylaws attached to many public parks that would infringe upon certain freedoms of expression in a sense, so there's a lot in there that can't be fixed just by a public art policy. That it requires an understanding of the need for dissensus and discourse within the public realm and the public space, and a clear distinction of what art's function within that discourse is.
So you're saying that you're thinking of art and of artists now as having this role of challenger of orthodoxy, as against an historical role where they were the endorsers and supporters and strengtheners of orthodoxy. Mm-hmm. That's a political shift in the conception of art and artist.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth considering can the census happen more easily within the gallery space or outside of the gallery space? And Project Art Centre is a good example of that, where just the facade of the building became the public realm, even though it was still attached to the art centre in itself, you know.
Well, I remember years ago, Esther Shalov-Gertz, who was in Dublin, she used an awful lot of projections down in North Strand. This is 30 years ago. Herself and Joachim Gertz had done the Hamburg-Harburg Memorial, the Holocaust Memorial. Ailbhe, can I come to you just to, I mean, you're sitting in number 70 Merrion Square, thinking about policy. Do you have views on this?
That's Sinead, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon, Sinead. Sorry, I beg your pardon.
I'm actually sitting at home. I haven't sat in 70 Merrion Square in 15 months. But what I'm interested in actually, in terms of what's after happening in the last 15 months, I think we're in a really new and interesting space in terms of how artists engage with people, because, you know, artists had to move outside and move onto a digital space and engage with people and almost become deinstitutionalized in some ways, in lots of respects, in terms of how artists are thinking about how they engage with audiences. And going back to that word that we keep using, that dialogue, you know, that is becoming more increasing. And we saw some fantastic examples of it in the last 15 months of where artists are really thinking differently and how they engage people. So, you know, a lot of art is moving out, and not just public places, but public spaces, including the digital space. And we look at how that influences policy. I'm really interested in what happened in the news yesterday. So if as part of the Brighton Year project recently, actually just finished up last week, there was a project by the ARC called What Did I Miss? And it was a live stream to schools of a play, but also workshops with young people who were in 6th class, moving from primary school into secondary school, talking about what did I miss. And what came through that workshop informed the Youth Council of the ARC, who then presented to the Oireachtas Committee yesterday to try and influence policy for young people. So, I mean, that all happened in a digital space, you know, and even the young people attended that Oireachtas Committee in a digital way. So we're really coming into a really interesting place and space in terms of how artists now engage with people, engage with audiences, and open up dialogue and create and co-create new work. It's not always about creating and presenting, but it's that co-creation piece is really important, and how that influences policy and how that will influence our work in terms of a national policy for public art going forward. I think will be really transformative. You know, it breaks open, it's breaking open so many boundaries in a very exciting way.
Does anybody want to come in? I was just wondering then, just on this question of time, let's deal briefly with this question of art and time, which is a fascinating one. Again, looking at the reflections of modus operandi, the notion of permanence is suggested to be just 20 or 30 years now, from that perspective. But a great deal of the work that Ailbhe and Ruairí and Nora are doing is actually work that is designed to fulfill a function of some form and then to pass, like a past conversation. It's still there, but it moves on. So do you have views on part of the difficulties of people commissioning, and I'm speaking now as the chair of the project in Grangegorman, is how to balance a limited budget so that each of these possibilities has the representation it can have in the district or in that part of the city. From your point of view, again, Ailbhe, I know this is something that has preoccupied you, and I know it is with you as well, Ruairí. I mean, you have strong views on this. How do you feel about the move of other art forms into what was once a visual arts arena, and the competition then for resources?
Well, I'll speak. I'll kick off. I think it's a wonderful thing. I mean, I can't imagine why visual arts would have only call on public space. So, I mean, and visual arts even in itself is such a broad church. So I think that what cross art form, support for cross art form projects and initiatives in the context of Percent for Art was very, very significant shift and a very important change. In relation to and demanded more of the administration of those funds and the creation of those opportunities. I worked as the liaison artist for Breaking Ground, which was a very significant public art program, for those that are not familiar with it, in the north side of the city in Ballymun, a huge social housing complex, the north of the city. It ran for over 10 years. But I think it's fair to say that there was an enormous amount of work that went into pooling that resource, the capital resource that came with the regeneration of Ballymun, in order to create those kinds of opportunities for cross art form, different lengths of times of engagement for artists with very different outcomes. So, and indeed, Jochen Gertz was one of the artists that was commissioned to that process. But maybe if I could just signal that one of the things that we're really trying to figure out this question of the transition, if you like, between that often happens between the kind of so-called, the sort of official timescale that's announced with a project, and particularly in our field, the natural momentum that builds if a project is really going very well in the context of place-based practice in particular. And I'm talking very specifically about our leading of the Arts Council's initiative, the Creative Places initiative, and we are specifically leading out on the pilot in Tuam. So we've just announced what we're calling a cooperative commission. And built into the language around that commission is, yes, the expectation that the project will realize something within a 15-month time frame, but we are signaling a commitment as an organization to work with the artists and the community members, should the energy be building around this project, to find and construct supports for it to continue beyond its kind of official timeline, because it is our experience that this is precisely what happens. If some of the as Nora said, some of the kind of flexibility is brought to bear, and we all consider and build into our intention around such initiative, that we will be required to stay with it for longer than we might anticipate. And this for us will be a hugely positive outcome. And what we're trying to do there is to influence our own work around creating the infrastructure. And it's not, and lastly, I will say, very importantly, is the 3-year commission. It's a 3-year commitment by the Arts Council to that funding arc in places in Ireland that have not been served by significant public investment in the arts. So it's, to go back to Padraic's point, I would say it's a confluence of conditions, and it's an ecology that needs to be created to address some of the questions we're tackling with here today.
Thanks, Ailbhe. Anybody else want to come in? Rory, you're on mute.
I first of all, I just think whether it's commissioning, you know, I just, this morning I had reasons to write and to look up how long it took to commission the Parnell Monument, the Connell Monument, and some, and the Thomas Davis, and they ranged from 40-something years, 60 years, 40 years, up to 15 years. So it's just kind of public art. They're 3 monuments, Nora, major nationalist monuments in Dublin from the 19th century right up to 1966. I think the first thing that isn't understood often enough, and it's said very clearly in the national guidelines for the Percent for Art scheme, is public art takes time. And whether it's to put a permanent artwork or whether it's engagement, and this is where I chime with Ailbhe, is that for art, whether it's to put an object into space or not, you know, the engagement that goes with it and the dialogue that goes with it is very important. I kind of worry when I get down to, and you use this word, the competition for resources. Well, this is, the arts have been the victim of this, and you as a chairperson of the Arts Council will have no better advocate for how it's not a competition, or as I often have put it, this isn't a competition between the CAT scan or the MRI scan versus art. We need both for a healthy society. So I like to leave that thing of the competition for resources, and rather than reducing it between the competition for visual arts versus drama versus opera versus music, that shouldn't enter it. It's about the context, about the situation, and about the opportunity. And another dangerous thing that crept in, I think particularly after the crash, which was particularly bad and impactful in Ireland, was this notion of value for money. You know, is it more valuable that I put a lump of bronze on a roundabout than actually engage with a music commission with teenagers in Kerry? You know, I know, for example, in the latter commission, that those people who engaged with this world-class musician are still in touch with them 16, 17 years later. So it comes back to those two words in my head. Which is it? Is it impact and endurance or visibility?
Thanks, Rory. Anybody else want to come in there? Well, let me, because time is moving on, I've just done that calculation, Nora, for your budget. It's in excess of 25 million euro. And I'd like to move to this question of generally resources, specifically % for art schemes and public support for art. I know you say with the Grangegorman scheme, we were working off, and I'm speaking from Ireland now, the specific budget we had was less than $1 million. And that came from not having an individual 64,000, which was the cap. The percent was a complete misnomer. It was actually pooled. We pooled the money from different buildings to make the possibility of having the variety of work we've done. And we all know in Ireland, and I'm sure it's also the same elsewhere, that the ambition of artists, and I'll speak specifically for Irish artists, has been extremely curtailed, coming back, I know, to what Rory's been referring to, by the impoverishment of resources. So I'd like to see or to discuss what the sources of financing for public art might be. The percent for art scheme in Ireland is restricted, and Sinéad might say something about that. It's not every government department, it's not every public contract. And a lot of the other work that might appear might be, and I'm thinking from my experience in universities, might come from university foundations, or it might come from a patron, from the alumnus of the university, or it might come within a hospital from somebody in the hospital who's very interested in and donates. We've had all of those experiences. But coming back to the ones that have some sort of public control connected to the notion of citizens' rights, that's where the percent for art scheme has its strength. And I'm wondering, Nora, Sinéad, whether you might have something to say on in Ireland where we're going, and then I'll come back to Paraic to see from what you've heard whether the international experience is something we should be more connected to, such as the experience of Nora. Sinéad.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the ambition has been curtailed by the budgets not having, you know, moved with the times since they were set back in the 90s at capped at 64,000. Pooling, as you know, some places are pooling well, and some places in some counties and some areas find it difficult to pool because the restrictions on the claiming of the funding don't allow that pooling to happen. So that's part of the work that we need to do, and that better cohesion of the schemes, that pooling can be better allowed and meet ambition in the sense that we've all been talking about. The raise of the funding for the capital programmes announced by the Minister in July 2019, and then it become effective from the 1st of January last year, they significantly change the potential. Now, it would be great to see, and if maybe when we open up the conversation here, it'd be good to see if anybody has been accessing those increased funding. We've heard some instances of it and some not so much, but I'd be keen to hear who's accessing, you know, those increased bands. But we're looking at, you know, now capped for very large capital projects at 500 million. 500,000. So 500 million, that'll be amazing. 500,000. So that is huge, you know. So, but the likes of Children's Hospital, missed out on that. That kind of scale of investment, which would have been amazing. And hopefully, the National Maternity Hospital, when that comes about, that will have that type of level of investment attached to it. So we look at that kind of level of funding, those big, large scale public developments. But, even for smaller, funds where smaller schemes where it might have been capped at about 25,000, that's now up to 50. So it's kind of a doubling of it has happened in the smaller scale, and then up higher. Still discretionary within some departments as to what they might apply within that. They are bands, so they can impose amount within that. But certainly, we have work to do, going forward to make sure that the scheme is being maximised to its best potential, that pooling is allowable, that that local authorities or hospitals or schools or wherever might be commissioning, can bring in the expertise that is needed to help them, do successful commissioning projects, because that is allowable there under the guidelines as we've mentioned before, those guidelines 2004, but they still exist, they're still relevant, and they're still in use. So so that's where we're going with funding under that scheme. But like I said at the very beginning, work to do.
Thanks, Sinead. Paraic, do you want to come in there? And
sure. Yeah, the European example, I guess, of how it's funded. The Percent for Art scheme might not be the major funder across a lot of states, and a lot of funding comes from direct cultural funding. A number of instances. There are some interesting ones where, like Germany and Belgium, on that capping that Sinead was talking about, like they increase or decrease the percentage dependent on how large the construction budget is, so that it can go up to 1.5% if it's a low amount of money, and then if it's a high amount of money for the construction, then it reduces down, and it varies from those two countries. Another one, like there are some examples of area-based application of the Percent for Art scheme, as opposed to like one specific construction of one building or one set of buildings, but rather to a whole urban area. And so there are, in Finland, there's examples of that, and it has kind of led to maybe an interpretation that an area is where to go to engage with art practice or that. But I don't know much about those in terms of the impact on over tourism and other factors that might come along with that. But yeah, that'll be the kind of the variations, I guess, of application. But as I say, the Percent for Art scheme is only one form of funding art in the public realm or public art across Europe.
Thanks, Paraic. Nora?
Well, traditionally, institutions and projects within the field of art receive a large degree of public support for their activities in Norway. So we don't really have any private patrons. It's very rare. So I would say that Public Art Norway, Koro, and of course the Art Council are some of the major funders of art in Norway. For Public Art Norway, most of the money we have to produce with are the money that comes through the Percent for Art schemes, and of course that's vulnerable because some years the states build a lot and some years they don't. So it's like it's hard to plan for like 20 years from now. And also the hospitals in Norway are not a part of the Percent for Art scheme, which is a problem. One thing is the Percent for Art scheme. The other thing is I talked about how we have schemes for artists and curator initiatives, and those schemes are quite small. We don't really have that much money in those schemes. So if there is something I would work for, it would be more support for free projects initiated by the artists and curators themselves, because they tend to be very different, unfortunately, from the projects that are created through the Percent for Art schemes.
Thanks, Nora. I'll go to Ailbhe now, and then I'll open to the floor for questions. You're on mute, Ailbhe.
Thank you. Just very briefly, it's in the context of, resources. I mean, yes, absolutely, we need to see an expansion of the resource base, but with that also, there's the unlocking of the resources that exist. So, like, for example, we speak of pooling the capital resources in relation to Percent for Art, but we mustn't under-describe the work that requires, and the expertise and the brokerage that comes with that. So I'm thinking of my experience of and watching what happened, and led by Aisling Pryor, and the work that went into actually pooling that resources, as you've described, Ciarán, with the Grangegorman. And I'm conscious that we've lost a lot of public arts officers from the local authority arts offices around the country. And this is a deficit in the infrastructure that we need to find a way to reinstate, because it's not just about the Percent for Art, but it goes back to that role of brokerage and general building of awareness, advocacy for courage in the kinds of commissioning that may come at a local level or around the country. And we see what comes with long-term investment in that role, such as in Dublin City Arts Office. We have Ruairí here with us, and indeed in Fingal, where we have Caroline Cowley, and I know she's speaking at this conference today. So as well as the overall resource, there is the expertise to unlock, grow, and bring together the resources. We've seen a deficit in that in the arts offices around the country.
Thanks, Ailbhe. Now I'm going to go to the floor, and I'd like to welcome Tanja Schult from Sweden. Tanja says, terrific presentations, thank you so much. My question, is there a risk that the public space is or gets overcrowded? Can we find ways to make space for new works without erasing the past? Who would like to take that question? Nora.
Yeah, well, with the recent debates on monuments and commemoration and the statues that are around everywhere from the last century, I'm not really sure if erasing is wrong always. We've been in Koro, we've been curating for eternity for a long time. We've not operated with any time limits, and I think we need to talk about limiting the time that the artworks that we place in public space should be. So I'm actually thinking a lot about time limits these days, and I think it might be reasonable actually to talk about a time limit.
And do you have any idea, just intuitively and without committing yourself, to what would be the duration of a piece in a public space without?
I think it's very hard to say. I think you have to consider every piece of art from, no, I don't think there should be a general rule. And of course, another question is sustainability, and from a sustainability perspective, it would of course be difficult or not so reasonable to talk about durability in that way. So it's a difficult question, but I'm considering whether we should actually have some. We should consider to have like a limited time for some of the artworks we put up, at least.
Thanks, Nora. Ruairí, would you like to come in?
Just very quickly, and I've great experience of this in terms of people wanted to put up a statue of Bram Stoker, and when we found a wonderful park out in Fairview, which is hardly up the mountains, for this opposite the birthplace of Bram Stoker, the response was, that's not good enough, it's not in the city centre. So my answer to Tanja is, why does every national monument, why does every disaster have to be commemorated in the city centre? Why does every... So let's start with Dublin. I'm focusing here on Dublin. Our city doesn't begin and end at the canals. It goes right out to Ballyfermot and up to Ballymun, and from Finglas down to Dublin South East. And it's just to embrace and not to be obsessed with the status of the city centre.
Thanks, Ruairí. Anybody else want to come in for Tanja? Sinéad?
Yeah, I suppose just on that question of, overcrowded, if we're talking about, a move towards, durational work or other artworks that might be sound-based or music-based or literary projects or trails or whatever it might be, that they're temporary, so there'll always be space for the new, if that's the case. If we're constantly thinking of the physical and the permanent, certainly the overcrowdings could happen. But yeah, if we're moving into that space, there is room.
Thanks, Sinead. Now I'm going to go on to anonymous attendee. Thank you, anonymous. How can policy be influenced to remove political, social, and community agendas so that the quality of contemporary artistic practice can be reflected in the artworks that are realized? In keeping with Mr. Ó'Cuív's, excuse me, that disappeared. Mr. Ó'Cuív's point about artists leading the way. Community and stakeholder engagement is being used as a scare mechanism, therein restricting the reflection of broad-ranging contemporary and fine art practices. Projects become less and less interesting for artists, and therefore the number of artists applying becomes smaller and smaller. It also denies the public their intelligence. The intense focus by policymakers and administrators on socially engaged practice and consultation has limited the growth in Ireland, restricted the number of artists who wish to apply for such schemes, resulting in roundabout art being the most likely to be funded. Perhaps the panel might have suggestions on a more balanced approach that widens the, quotes, patrons, commissioners of public art. Who would like to take that? Paraic.
Yeah, I think I mentioned some of those terms that propped up there in terms of the so like I was talking about local authority value and social added value. I was talking about earlier on, and these kind of terms, and I think there's a well, I don't agree with a lot of the points made. I do see some merit in some perspectives. There is a way of looking at some approaches to public art where it can potentially be used as an instrumental use of cultural budgets to prop up other policy agendas, not by the artist or by the immediate commissioner, but by the maybe the government direction or politics or policies at a particular time. So that's one way of that's one way. There's a danger that can happen at any time that we need to be aware of. But then the other way to look at it is it's a move towards more people-centered or community-focused. This is a public space. It's not a private space. So there always will need to be a move towards, and it's not a neutral space. No space is neutral. So there are stakeholders that need to be consulted and need to be brought into the process of commissioning or realizing a work. But the other point I do also maybe like putting an artist hat on. I would maybe fear in some ways that a total move away from any form of physical presence. I think Tanja was bringing that up as well. That we shouldn't totally discount any form of physical works. That there still is a need for that, and but it's obviously context led, and context is specific and needs led. But I don't think it diminishes and the idea of community or stakeholder engagement doesn't diminish the art practice, but it is a different form of art practice than the art practice that happens in a gallery space, and it has to be acknowledged that it's a totally different form of art making, and has to be seen as that.
Okay, would anybody else like to come in? Ailbhe?
Thank you. I think there is, of course, an argument to be made for plurality. We go nowhere if we go for either or one over the other. That's what I would say. That would be a mistake. How socially engaged, community-based, temporal public art projects are realized. At their best, they have come out of conditions that have deep respect for the sophisticated analysis, life experience, and analysis that exists within the public, who happen to maybe be gathered in a community of place or a community of interest, but nonetheless, we're talking about public. At their very best, they are better than the sum of their parts, and they are what happens when artists align with, work closely with, learn from, unlearn with, and co-create with a sophisticated community embodied knowledge that can speak to a particular issue at a particular moment in time. At its worst, it is a process of instrumentalization where nobody really wins. The work is not strong, the experience is poor, the artist feels that they've had to work through many different hoops. And I would say that for ourselves as an organization, particularly, let's say, speaking very specifically about our initiative, the Cooperative Commission, it is our duty to create support structures that make as many demands of us as a commissioning agency in this context as they do of any artist, and indeed do not in any way patronize or assume that local knowledges and embodied experiences and cultural practice at a local level are somehow to be set aside, or indeed cannot influence or have a role to play in the co-creation and shaping of compelling, pertinent, critically relevant, and artistically and aesthetically strong artworks, whether they're permanent or temporary.
Thanks, Ailbhe. Anybody else want to come in?
I'd just like to say, and I think Nora said it first here, the critical important document is the brief, and it's really, it sets the scene, and yeah, nothing more to add to that, Nora. Just, yeah, you're right. Most important document in commissioning.
Well, given that the brief has been put together well, if we go back to the commissioning process, is it the case, and three of you commission, possibly four, is it the case that as a matter of principle, you would always have a member or more of local communities on the commissioning body? And I'll connect that to a further question to Ruairí from Tanja. Could Ruairí develop his wonderful idea of trust the public in capitals as decision makers further? So I'll put those two together.
First of all, yes, we would always, working on a commissioning brief at the moment, and the dialogue with the section in Dublin City Council was to have public representation, both elected but also community. And back to the other challenging question, is about the public. This is not, this is that we are starting off on a journey. We have thought about it very deeply for the last year. We're now hoping to get out into the field in 3 areas as pilot projects, and to invest, not that we have the results this time next year, to invest 2 years before we're starting to actually fundamentally commission, that great art, whatever that great art is. And I don't think it's a question of being anti-socially engaged. This is fundamentally socially engaged practice, and it is about pushing the public. So this is about giving time. I cannot lay out the map, because then that would be taking away, that it would be fundamentally contradictory to what we're trying to do. Is that if we get out into these areas, into these contexts, we want to be working with them. So I won't answer that question, because otherwise I would be falling into that trap of telling the public and telling the communities what they want and what they need. But we will get them time to tell us what they want and what they need.
All right, thanks, Ruairí. Ailbhe, as a commissioner, do you have a policy of bringing in the public to the commissioning process?
I think that what I would say to that is, well, yes, but I would say that the commissioning process comes directly out of an already existing process of collaboration. So, for example, we could not have come up with the current framework for the Cooperative Commission in Tuam had we not been there already for a year and a half, albeit at a distance, because we haven't, Carol Ann, our coordinator, was there for 6 weeks before the pandemic. So in a sense, it has been deeply informed by all of the interactions on the ground with local artists, local cultural practitioners, steering group members, and so on and so forth. So the short answer is absolutely yes, but it's less that we devise the commission and then hope to get people to support it. It's rather that it comes into being, if you like, out of an already existing collaborative creative process that we're engaged with.
Thanks, Ailbhe. Nora?
Yeah, I would say the same as Ailbhe, actually. We believe in a good anchoring process throughout the whole project, from the beginning to the end. However, we do not work within committees anymore, so we do not believe in one representative in a committee with the architect, the builder, and so on. But yes, of course, we definitely work with anchoring processes.
Sinead, from the general policy point of view, is there a policy on specifically engaging members of local communities who may well share a different view of what art and public art should be?
Yeah, can I speak from, I suppose, their perspective? I would have worked on in the past, but there are probably a number of people here when the participants in the webinar who have local policies and have those that within it in terms of that public engagement piece right from the outset. But the last maybe commissioning process I ran ourselves, similar to Ailbhe, we would have designed it with the community in mind, or not the community in mind, but the community at the table, so that they were there as part of it. It was their ideas. We were addressing projects and ideas that mattered to the local community, rather than coming in with an idea ourselves, or coming in with a brief and then artist ideas attached to it. So yeah, it was that type of process that I would have been involved in previously, but certainly from the local authority public art policies, which are the ones that we have in this country, are come from the ground up. Certainly most of them that I have seen have that element attached to it. Yeah.
Paraic, do you have anything you want to add on the democratization of the commissioning process, community engagement?
Not particularly. I'm not sure, like, from a process. I guess there needs to be a lot of engagement, but it can be it can mislead the process in some ways as well when there isn't the proper guidance through the process of the expert or the agency involved, because like as Ailbhe was talking about, the plurality, like it's not about consensus. It's not about everyone having a vote and then the most popular submission winning, because that I don't know, there was that example of the O'Connell Street Monument competition in the late 1980s, where the submissions were put into the GPO, and there were like 10 submissions, and then it was put to a public vote, and the public voted for an exact copy of the Arc de Triomphe on O'Connell Street. So like the popular vote isn't really what is appropriate, but dialogue and engagement and time, as Ailbhe keeps pointing out, the time to develop relationships and trust is very important to the process.
Thanks, Paraic. Now I have one last brief question, and that's for Nora, anonymous attendee. Does Public Art Norway make their public art policies, such as the Good Brief, available online?
We don't, but we should do, and we will do.
Well, there you are, anonymous attendee. We've got progress. Now, is there anything that, before we finish, that any of the panelists would like to say before we conclude? Everybody's happy. Ailbhe.
Sorry, just maybe to pick up on the last point that I think is important that Paraic made, and it's maybe just to sort of, for me, it's just about sort of bringing my thoughts together in the context of consultation and engagement and open dialogue. The goal here is not, as, and the Paraic is very right about this, it's not to create a kind of a flattening. If anything, our job, I mean, I speak now as an artist. The work of an artist is to keep the space for ideas open. And similarly, and those ideas and that space can be highly contingent, highly experimental, difficult to understand, can yield marvelous, wonderful, new, exciting work, compelling, challenging work. But it's so too can it be the opposite of that. So the point that I would be making in relation to the work that goes in to creating the ground is that that you are, if anything, making the space more open for all of those possibilities, not determining the space, rather building advocacy and understanding around the importance of keeping the space open for those ideas, whatever they might be, to come to fruition. Difficult and all as they might be, wonderful and all as they might be, artistically compelling as they might be. That's the work. That's why you engage. That's why you do the work. Not to close it down, and certainly never to determine what it might be.
Thanks, Ailbhe. That's a perfect note on which to thank all of the panel for excellent ideas. We never anticipated that we'd be clearing up all the problems. We simply want to identify where they're going. I'd like to thank all of you who've joined us in the audience, particularly from abroad, because I know Ireland would very much like to connect, as we have with Nora and indeed with others, connect with our colleagues in Europe, because it's a common problem, a common set of promises that we want to develop. And I'd like to thank everybody at home. I know Sinéad has lots of plans for accelerating and making more efficient the Irish operation of the Percent for Art scheme. So thanks, everybody. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Lovely to see you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.